we get to start on part 6, which is attitudes and behavior. And some of these concepts are things that we've touched on very, very briefly before when they overlapped with some other concepts, but we're going to talk about them sort of separately here. And so attitudes are basically going to be sort of positive or negative evaluative reactions that we have towards a particular stimulus. So how do we think about things? So you can have an attitude towards a certain brand or a certain company or a certain topic in class. And those can vary depending on a bunch of different evaluations. So you can change your ideas or opinions about something based on experience and exposure and a whole bunch of other aspects. And when we're looking at these attitudes, we typically have 3 components that we consider. We have cognitive aspects, where we look at our sort of thoughts and logical thinking about how we should think about this thing. We will also have an affective component, which is our emotional or feelings towards something. And then we also have a behavioral component, and that's going to be our overt actions. So if we if we feel strongly about a particular brand, maybe we support them by buying their products or by investing in that company. And typically, we're going to want to see some kind of agreement between what we think about this thing, how we feel about it, and how we act towards it. But of course, if we've mentioned that that's our hope, we probably also know that there are going to be situations when it doesn't quite line up. But for a visual of this, we can have sort of a situation or an initiator. So we have all sorts of stimuli that can lead us to start developing ideas. So products or situations, stores, people who are sort of encouraging you to buy a particular product or giving sort of personal statements about their experience with those products. So these are ways that we can gather information to try and decide how we're going to respond. Well, we have those 3 components. The affective is that emotional component. The cognitive is sort of what we think about it, and the behavioral is what we do because of that. And all of that together becomes our attitude, how we are sort of oriented towards that object. Do we have a positive view or a negative view? So we're kind of putting it all together there. And with a lot of these different things, we kind of want to keep in mind that sometimes with our attitudes, these are things that we think about and we are sort of acutely aware of, where we might know that we have a particular brand that we like and support, or we might know that there's a particular person or company that we really don't like and intentionally don't support. But we also then have to look at sort of those underlying things. We have those unconscious influences where sometimes you might think, hey, I really dislike this particular company, but maybe you also buy a lot of their products. So your actions are then going against the other aspects where you thought you felt negatively about it and you had these sort of logical arguments against them, but your actions don't line up. So you end up in sort of this state of dissonance where things don't quite match. We also want to keep in mind that sometimes our attitudes can end up having a larger or even smaller effect on our behavior, on our thoughts and things, based on how much we care. Because, yeah, you might have a particular brand that you really like, but if we look at something like, say, Pepsi versus Coke, and you go to a restaurant, and typically you're like, yeah, I prefer Coke over Pepsi, but this restaurant only has Pepsi products. Does that actually bother you all that much? Maybe not. So it kind of depends on how strongly you hold your beliefs, your attitudes. So they tend to end up affecting our behavior, and they end up sort of being more intense if we actually have a more strong belief or a more strong opinion on that topic. But for a lot of the stuff that we interact with, we're kind of in the neutral territory. We also want to note that with our attitudes, they aren't necessarily going to be a perfect prediction of how we might behave in a situation. So again, depending on how strongly we hold on to those attitudes, those beliefs that come with it, we might be sort of more or less influenced by them in our actions. So we're a lot better off using an attitude as sort of a prediction of broad patterns of behavior, sort of overall tendencies, as opposed to single instances of how we would act in this situation. Because there's all of those situational factors that can play into it and influence where we lean. They absolutely can change throughout your lifetime. Usually it's going to be a matter of getting into one of these states of cognitive dissonance where something doesn't line up from our three components. So you might realize that I act this way, but I think this way, and then you might have to change either the way you think or the way you act to bring them back into line. So usually it's when you're sort of faced with stuff that doesn't quite line up. And when we look at something that like cognitive dissonance, it actually ends up creating like internal anxiety. So you have that tension and you need to find a way to fix it. So you're going to then make adjustments to try and get around that. And yeah, so this cognitive dissonance theory came from Leon Festinger, but it basically says that when our attitudes and behaviors are inconsistent, it sets up a state of unease. And then we get motivated to try and reduce that state of tension. So we're going to want to try and sort of bring things back into line. And this lines up with a lot of our developmental type theories, where if stuff conflicts, we're going to make some adjustments to make them fit. And so in this situation, we're usually going to end up either changing our attitude or our behavior, so the way we think about it or feel about it, or how we're acting towards it. Or if we go an unhealthy route, we might end up distorting our attitude or our behavior. And so in that situation, you might sort of start telling yourself, well, I don't buy that much of this product, so I'm really not supporting them that much. Or maybe you'd say that, well, maybe I don't think that strongly about this company or that company. So you can sort of modify or reframe how you think about these things or how you act towards these things to try and forcibly reduce that dissonance without actually changing anything dramatically. Oh, this was just a flow chart showing the exact same thing, which we don't need to do a second time. But if we wanted examples, I actually borrowed this from one of my other texts, which basically shows if you're going to change your attitude or your behavior, or you can distort your attitude or behavior. This is looking at individuals who smoke and why they might choose to change either their opinions on smoking or their behavior and stop smoking, or how they might end up distorting their attitude or behavior. And these are easy enough to read through, so I won't do it myself, but this just sort of shows one example of how you might change these. Our next section gets us into stereotypes, which I had hinted that we would get into. So we had talked earlier about sort of stereotypes, then we'll get into prejudice and then discrimination as sort of a continuum of ideas. But we had mentioned earlier that stereotypes are basically just our attitudes or opinions about individuals based on their group affiliation. So this is us making mental shortcuts, ideas about how things tend to apply to groups of people. And I had stressed at the beginning that these aren't necessarily sort of good or bad. Usually when you hear the term stereotype, you assume bad, but that'll come up more when we get into discrimination and prejudice, where the negative connotation is kind of assumed. But for stereotypes, we're really just thinking about them for this class in terms of shortcuts, mental concepts that allow us to sort of not have to think about all the individuals within a group, but to treat the group as a whole. And I had used the example last time about considering students in different classes. So if I have a 100 level class, I'm assuming that my students are probably first year students, and they probably have very little prior exposure to psychology concepts if they're in my 104 or 105 class, so I should teach at a certain level. If I later gain more information about any one student and learn, hey, they actually have a background in biology that ends up overlapping heavily and they know a lot more of these concepts than what I would have assumed, I can adjust that by that individual. But, like I've said, if you're teaching large numbers of students, sometimes it's just safer to go with some assumptions based on your experience in the past with those groups. And in this situation, we're typically looking at this difference between in-groups and out-groups, which is a term that's kind of popped up a couple of times, but I don't think we've properly defined. But basically, when we talk about our in-group, this is going to be the individuals that you relate to. So in my school example, I might be talking about sort of my in-group being instructors. So people that I talk to about teaching, who I assume have similar experiences to me, but because I'm part of that group, I'm a little bit more likely to view my group as heterogeneous, meaning that we all have different experiences. I know that even within the group of people I got my degree with, we shared an office and we were in the same lab and we got the same degree at about the same time. We actually all have different specialties. So I teach a lot of learning and sort of brain processes and sensation and perception stuff. One of them teaches a lot of neuroscience and sort of drugs and behavior. And another is a lot more into social psychology. So we all have very different experiences, and I take that into consideration from experience. But in contrast, the out group, or the others, people who are not the instructors, so my example of students, it's been a long time since I could relate to that group, because it's been a while since I was an undergraduate. But because of that lack of experience, we tend to view the out group as homogeneous, where we assume that they're all going to behave similarly or have similar motivations or similar traits. And again, it can be easier to think that way until you gain more information. So it's not necessarily harmful. It's just the way we tend to think about things. And it gives us that little bit of a shortcut to preserve sort of mental processing. But yeah, it's another thing with the stereotypes is if you can acknowledge that you know you're using a shortcut and you know that it's not a full picture, sometimes you can help not make some of the mistakes that you might make otherwise. But yeah, for the most part, it's one of those things where it's like, this is just how our brains tend to try and process information. We've mentioned things like schemas, where we have those shortcuts of this is what I anticipate or this is what I expect. And then we kind of get surprised with violations as time goes on and have to adjust if necessary. But it's the same basic idea where our brains like to conserve resources. Relating to stereotypes, we can actually talk about stereotype threat. And this is when an individual or a group can actually experience pretty significant fear of confirming negative expectations about their own social group. So this is something like if there's a stereotype about your ethnicity or about your sex or about like any group that we want to talk about, some people would be really, really stressed about, well, what if my actions end up supporting that stereotype and make people more certain that that stereotype is accurate? So in that situation, they actually end up, because of this anxiety, they're kind of in a self-fulfilling prophecy where they worry so much about making their group look bad that they might end up too worked up to perform at their best and end up scoring poorly and therefore making their group look bad, at least in their own minds. And so this is something that's been studied pretty dramatically in a bunch of different groups, but we're going to look at an example with mathematical abilities across gender. And so here we have, so in the high stereotype threat group at the bottom here, high stereotype threat is basically where before taking a standardized test, a group of individuals were informed that, hey, statistically speaking, boys tend to perform better on this test than girls. And because of that, the girls then have higher levels of reported stress, worrying that they're going to perform poorly and end up supporting that perceived stereotype. The low ST, low stereotype threat, was that they were told that the scores were equal or some other sort of controlling topic. And we can see that when all things are equal, they perform almost the same, if not having the girls scoring higher. But when that stereotype is sort of refreshed, when they're reminded of that, their scores tend to be lower. And this holds across a bunch of different groups. Mostly it's been done with things like math tests or memorization tasks. But yeah, they tend to find something like this fairly consistently. And that's a nice tie back with our self-fulfilling prophecies that we mentioned before, because by anticipating poor performance, we end up performing poorly because of the stress there. Then, as promised, we can get into prejudice, which is a learned negative attitude or opinion that an individual directs towards certain groups. So in this situation, we're basically going from stereotypes where it could be good or bad, it's just sort of a concept. Here we're stressing that it is a negative attitude. And in this situation, they're typically, I'm stressing again, stereotypes are overgeneralizations, but not necessarily negative. Prejudice is definitely negative. And in this situation, prejudice is typically something that's learned. So whether it's from your family group or your peer group or the environment, the culture that you're in, usually you're observing how others interact with this group or how they talk about this particular group. And then you usually end up sort of echoing those beliefs. And if we remember back to the development chapter, we had that discussion of how people determine sort of their own morality, where when we're younger, we tend to try and sort of do what our parents want so we don't get in trouble. And then we usually have beliefs that line up with our parents because that's what we were taught. And then we usually have beliefs and moral ideas that come from our peer group. And then we develop our own eventually. This is the same basic process where usually you're going to start with sort of whatever you were raised with. And then as you get older, you might maintain that or you might move past that depending on your scenario. And we see a lot of changes over time. So it might be sort of that generational divide where some individuals were raised with a lot more prejudice, especially sort of the fear of the outgroup, of the other. And there's a lot of, especially political situations where they end up sort of latching onto that fear of the other to try and make people sort of direct their hatred towards a particular group because it can be beneficial to those political situations. But that ends up tying us really nicely into discrimination, where we have averse behaviors that are directed at the groups that you hold that negative prejudicial belief toward. So prejudice is just the ideas, and discrimination is when you act upon those ideas. So we're stressing stereotypes are just generalizations with no directionality. Prejudice, negative attitudes, beliefs, and then discrimination is negative actions based on those negative attitudes. So we're telling them all apart, and there may or may not probably be a question where you're asked to differentiate between the three. And there's a ton of different theories of discrimination. Obviously, because we don't get tons of time, we'll talk very, very briefly about two. One is the scapegoat theory, and this is basically where people will target groups that have less power or less standing than their perceived in-group, because by putting another group down, you end up feeling empowered. Basically, by dropping another group below you, you feel like you have been relatively elevated in terms of standing. And in this situation, it's mostly been studied looking at minorities targeting minorities. But as per usual, when we start looking at sort of more complex social issues, it ends up being a lot more complicated than what some of the theories would propose. Our second theory, the realistic conflict theory, this is when we frame things as a competition for limited resources. And so it's basically go back to our political examples. When people start talking about, say, hey, immigrants are stealing jobs. So jobs are that limited resource, and then we're pointing to the other, the outsider, as something to be fearful of or to be angry towards because of that competition for a limited resource. In a lot of situations where things are framed like that, there isn't necessarily as much limitation as it might be framed as, but by evoking that fear, and especially fear of sort of survival and livelihood, it can make people be very strongly motivated, and it can cause a pretty strong direction of sort of hate and discrimination towards groups that are being mentioned in that way. So those are the two big ones that we talk about. There are obviously many, many others, but that's what we get. And then for our mixed bag of attitudes here, we actually have one slide on interpersonal attraction, which actually seems very out of place, but there was no better location for it. And this is sort of what factors might lead people to like one another. Because there's a whole bunch of different sort of phrases and sayings, things like, oh, opposites attract. And people have, of course, tried to study that. And if we go with the opposites attracting, that's actually a myth, where people typically find that in long-term studies, they have to have at least some complementary or matching qualities in order to last longer. Where if people are complete opposites, they tend to conflict with one another and tend not to be able to last as long in relationships. So this would be something like if you have someone who's very introverted and very extroverted, they might find each other exhausting after a time just because of those conflicts. When we look at factors that increase how much we like an individual, attractiveness plays a role. We typically find that it's sort of that biological tying in, where usually we judge people on attractiveness based on symmetry and lack of imperfections, which is actually something that usually comes from having good genes or having been raised in an environment where you had access to all the necessary resources. So as long as you weren't raised in a deprived environment, you typically have some amount of symmetry in your face. But there are also biological aspects and genetic aspects that underlie that. Proximity is a huge one. So kind of like our mere exposure effect, where the more you are encountering something, the more you tend to like that thing. That actually applies to humans too. So as you interact with the same people over and over again, that familiarity actually ends up making you sort of more tolerant of them and enjoy their company more. And like we said, with the opposites thing, some level of similarity is actually pretty important. So if you find that you are interacting with people and you share hobbies or opinions or classes, you might find that that helps with that forming of relationships. And so instead of the phrase, the saying of familiarity breeds contempt, we would actually say it's more content, where the more we get exposed to one another, we actually tend to enjoy each other's company more. There are, of course, going to be exceptions to that. If somebody has, say, a very grating personality, spending more time with them might not make you more fond of them. But for the most part, as long as there aren't any sort of big conflicts, interacting with individuals usually just makes you more comfortable with them. So now we get to start on aggression. And so we're going to do aggression and then maybe get a little bit into pro-social behavior. So aggression and then helping as our two final sections here. But when we look at aggression, this is behavior that's intended to harm another individual. And when it comes to aggression, there's a whole bunch of different factors that we might be concerned about. But if we look at some biological factors, as with a lot of the traits that we talk about, there is some heredity to aggression. So we actually find that our identical twins that share 100% of their genetics, they tend to have more similar levels of aggression than looking at fraternal twins. And a lot of these studies, because that's a pretty vague way to say it, it's like how do you actually quantify aggression? You can look at things like arrest records. So if you look at identical twins, if one of them has a lot of arrests for aggressive crimes, is their twin then more likely to also have similar type arrest records? Or we can actually look at things like monitoring them in schools and seeing if they have similar amounts of time as they were sent to the principal's office, or things like that. There's a bunch of ways to get at it kind of indirectly. And we do typically find that, yeah, there is some genetic factor that's involved there. I don't know that I have a slide on it, but there are at least a couple of different genes that have been flagged for a bunch of different reasons. Sometimes because they affect things like hormones. One of the big ones, it's actually called the RAGE gene, is the MAOA 3, I think, is the version, but it's a particular variant, a particular mutation at a certain gene site, and individuals with that mutation are far more likely to end up arrested and imprisoned for committing violent crimes. And it's actually one where, if you have the time, there's an entire documentary that was done on it. And it's called something ridiculous like Born to Rage or whatever. But if you search MAOA Rage Gene documentary, it's one of the ones that pops up. And it's really interesting where they actually go around and interview a bunch of people in positions or roles that you might assume are very aggressive or not aggressive, including looking at a bunch of monks, Buddhist monks. They talk to a bunch of people in a motorcycle gang. They talk to a bunch of lawyers. And then they actually blood test them all to see which ones do and don't have that particular version of the gene. And as a little bit of a sort of draw you in, the researcher who's conducting the study, he's conducting the study because he himself has the gene and was kind of curious to figure out how that affects people's behavior. And they talk about the fact that, yes, the gene can predispose you towards these aggressive acts, but having a nurturing environment and having an outlet for that aggression can actually sort of cushion you against expressing that, which is very, very interesting. But yes, a cool documentary if you wanted to waste, say, 20 minutes. In this situation, we actually have, this is looking at some of our not quite reflexive behaviors, but I think they're fixed action patterns would be the best term for these. But we have some species, these are sticklebacks, cartoon versions of them, but these guys actually have a series of actions that they will carry out instinctually when they have something entering into their territory. So these guys tend to aggressively defend their area where they're nesting, and their sign of somebody being a potential threat is when they come in and have that red belly on them. So for them, as soon as they see another fish with a red belly, they fixate on that stimulus and they start instigating this aggressive pattern of actions. And they have a whole display meant to sort of chase off these threats. And these weird, not quite fish shapes at the bottom were actually a bunch of different variations that they tried to actually show that for these fish, they don't need it to be a proper fish shape for it to trigger that natural response. In fact, it just needs to be sort of oval shaped with red on the bottom, and that's sufficient. So they had a bunch of different sort of more or less detailed versions, and honestly, you can just have an oval with a red belly, and they will go through a full aggressive display every single time. And because of that sort of repetitive predictive nature, you can sort of determine what it is that triggers that aggression. And because it's then happening the same way without modification and it isn't learned, it tells us that it's something genetic to them. There are other fixed action patterns, so we know that this isn't just special to aggression. The usual when we talk about these are things like geese have an egg rolling behavior, where if they spot an egg outside of their nest, they engage in a sequence of events where they stand up, they stretch their necks out, and then they nudge the egg back underneath them in the nest. And you can trigger that using eggs or rocks or beer cans or wooden blocks. As long as it's in the right location, it automatically establishes and starts this sequence of events. And once it's initiated, it actually doesn't end until they finish. So you can walk over and pick up the egg as soon as they start standing up, and they'll go through the whole thing without anything to roll, which is very interesting to see. But their aggressive behavior is like that. So you can remove the stimulus and they will continue their aggressive display until they're completed, even though you've removed the potential threat, which is kind of cool. So that's more of that biological component. There can be a genetic aspect, but this is usually one of those special cases. We only know about it in sticklebacks. It tends to be a lot more complicated in other species. When we start looking at sort of potential biological sources, things that might be involved in aggression, we probably won't be surprised with a lot of the areas we start talking about. So the amygdala, no one should be surprised. We talk a lot about our amygdala and the fact that it's related to aggression and anger and fear, all of those intense emotions. So typically, having high activation in the amygdala is usually going to be linked to high levels of aggression. But we also end up seeing that deficient frontal lobe activity is also going to correspond to higher levels of aggression, which again, if we think back to talking about impulsive behavior in teens, and it's all about their prefrontal cortex not being fully developed, well, having sort of reduced activity in that frontal lobe and then not being able to inhibit aggressive impulses, it kind of makes sense. So typically our frontal lobe is involved in considering consequences of our actions, considering potential threats, and deciding what the best course of action is. So reduced activity would mean that we're probably going to go with our gut instinct, and a lot of times that's going to be something that's coming from our amygdala. If we were, I don't know that we talked about it in this class, but when we have things like incoming evaluations of potential threats, we have that information split off and it goes to sort of sensory areas for processing, but it also goes directly to our amygdala via our thalamus. That's where the split happens. But it's going to send it to our amygdala to have that quick gut response, which makes sense evolutionarily. If you have a threat coming at you, you want to respond quickly, but you need that sort of larger thinking process to be able to slow the amygdala down or stop that impulse if necessary. And if you don't have the ability to do that, if you have reduced activity in your frontal lobe to consider all of that, you might not be able to put the brakes on that action quick enough to not act on those aggressive impulses. And then at the bottom here, we're saying that, yeah, we typically don't have a single structure that's going to turn on or turn off aggression. It's usually an integration of a bunch of areas. So the emotional component goes through the amygdala, the frontal lobe is pulling on the amygdala and our sensory areas and past experiences and a whole bunch of other information to integrate it all together to make that decision. So we want to sort of keep that in mind. With our hypothalamus, we can also have something going on there. Because if you remember, our hypothalamus is going to be doing a lot of involvement with sort of monitoring stuff throughout our body, but also part of sending out instructions through our hormones. So it's part of that endocrine system as well. So stimulating the hypothalamus would probably cause higher levels of hormones and higher levels of aggression, and destroying it or lesioning it tends to reduce that, again, probably through fluctuations in hormones and other systems that it's involved in. But yeah, it's not as clear cut as here's how we turn it on and here's how we turn it off. There's multiple systems that all get integrated. And if we want some of the evidence that ends up supporting some of that, with the frontal lobes, we actually see that in individuals, again, imprisoned for violent crimes, individuals like murderers or people who have been arrested for assault, they end up showing lower activity in their frontal lobe, and that ends up sort of correlating with impulsive behaviors like we had anticipated. With serotonin, serotonin is one of our neurotransmitters, and having low levels of serotonin seems to be involved in higher levels of aggression, but having too much serotonin doesn't necessarily make you less aggressive, so it's not necessarily, again, a perfect switch. Testosterone is definitely involved here, where higher levels of testosterone tend to be associated with more aggression, but this is usually directed towards sort of social situations. They've called it social aggression. And that kind of makes sense because testosterone is one of those sex hormones. So it would be involved in, say, fighting off potential threats or defending potential mates, more of that biologically inclined type behaviors. So that's probably what's going on there. And one thing to keep in mind with testosterone is that we always assume that it's involved with just male biology, but it's present in females as well and can also influence their levels of aggression. So it's not just tied to one sex or the other, it actually affects both. Our next little bit is sort of looking at some of the ideas of where aggression might be derived from, what might lead to aggression. So a couple of these are very interesting to consider. One of the early ones was the idea that people tend to get frustrated and that frustration leads to aggression, aptly named the frustration-aggression hypothesis. But basically the idea is if people get more and more frustrated, they're going to be more impulsive, more aggressive, and then higher levels of aggression towards others. This had some evidence for a while, but it seems to be much more complex than that, to nobody's surprise at this point. So this one isn't accepted any longer. And the reason why is because we don't always respond to frustration with aggression. Yes, some people might. When they get really, really frustrated, it might make them feel better to throw a pillow or go for a run or go boxing or something to sort of let out, vent that frustration, which we'll swing back around to. But that's not always the case, and a lot of people have healthy ways to deal with frustration. It can be as simple as taking a step back and taking a deep breath and trying again. So we tend not to find as clean of a correlation between frustration levels and aggression levels as this theory would have proposed. We also know that aggression can end up coming from multiple stimuli. So you can have high levels of frustration or low levels of frustration and still end up seeing aggression or not. They tend not to be directly connected. But things like being provoked can lead people to be more aggressive. So if somebody comes up and threatens you or gets in your face or pushes you, that might be a lot more of a link to aggression. Being in very crowded areas and leading to more interactions with others can definitely connect. Heat is one of those where it can lead people to be more frustrated and also more aggressive, but that might not be that heat causes frustration and frustration causes aggression. It might just be that by having that body temperature off, by having your system out of whack, it might be involved. There's a whole bunch of other possible explanations here, and we don't have tons of time for all of them. But yeah, we're just saying that it's probably not the best explanation. So what else might lead to aggression? Of course, I'm going to slip in a little bit of learning stuff because that's my jam. But if we look at reinforcement, so we see that if individuals have successfully relied on aggression to get something they want in the past, they are then more likely to rely on that in the future. So we get this reinforcement where you are rewarded for being aggressive, and it increases your likelihood of being aggressive in the future. So if you look at kids, where if they've fought somebody and by fighting them, they get to take their favorite toy, that's then going to make them quicker to be aggressive next time they want that toy because it worked in the past. But it doesn't have to be sort of direct experience like that. It can also come from social learning or modeling, where if children watch somebody else be aggressive, they are also then more likely to copy that behavior themselves. So it especially comes from, say, shared environments. If they have aggressive parents, they are a lot more likely to model that behavior and be aggressive themselves because they've seen it in action, they've seen it work. So they get sort of vicarious conditioning or vicarious reinforcement, where the next time they're in that situation themselves, they will copy it. We can also tie this to an experiment, our Bandura experiment, where he had his Bobo the Clown, where if children watched an adult fight the clown and make somebody laugh, or if they got praise for it, the children themselves would be very aggressive towards that doll. Whereas if the person who was aggressive towards the doll was scolded or told off, then the children wouldn't act aggressively with it. So by watching others, they can learn to copy or not copy that behavior depending on the consequences. Another thing that we want to consider, tying in some more social aspects, get a little bit away from some of the biological stuff, we can start looking at a couple of things that will determine how we feel about aggression. So sometimes people will try and make themselves feel better about being aggressive, and we see a little bit of some cognitive distortions here. So they'll try and justify their actions using things like, hey, if they blame the victim. So this is either their own actions of aggression and being like, oh, well, they did something wrong and I only responded. So it's partially their fault. It's less on me. It's also on them. So we're shifting the blame. This is actually fairly common if you've seen, say, people look at violence in, say, a rough neighborhood, and somebody's response is, oh, well, they shouldn't have been in that neighborhood. You're blaming the victim for that aggression. Even though it was directed at them, you're sort of kind of putting the blame on them. Sometimes people will minimize the seriousness. Oh, well, I just shoved them. They did worse. Or it wasn't that bad. It could have been much worse. I could have done more. Again, sort of downplaying their own role. And sometimes they'll go so far as to try and dehumanize the victim. So instead of considering them as another person, an individual, you might frame them as sort of less than. And this can tie into some of this sort of stereotype discrimination stuff, especially with some outgroups, where a lot of times that process of sort of identifying others as outgroups involves treating them as less than human, or by sort of reducing that individual difference and things like that. So it can all kind of tie together. If we get into intentionality, this is really, really neat, but if we perceive others as having hostile intent, we will then be more likely to respond aggressively and feel justified in that aggression. This is also tying into things like our perception of pain from another's actions changes on our view of their intentions. So if we think they're trying to hurt us, we will score our pain as higher, more painful, than if we thought that it was an accident. So that perception of what we think was driving them dramatically affects our interpretation of the exact same stimulus. And so that can tie in here. We can also start looking at things like empathy. And if we can relate to another individual more, if we have more of that connection to them, we might sort of feel more for them, be less likely to be aggressive, be more likely to sort of empathize with them if they've experienced aggression. But it's kind of like the opposite of when we were talking about dehumanizing. That would be sort of separating yourself from them and having less empathy. This would be the other side of that spectrum. So if you understand them more and connect more, you will be less likely to be aggressive. And empathy can tie in with sort of emotional regulation. So you want to sort of be able to control your emotions, but also be able to echo the emotions of others, just to see if that sort of helps with that connection process. And then the last idea I want to get into is this principle of catharsis, which I've kind of hinted at without naming yet. And this is that idea that people think that if they're really upset about something, they're really angry about something, they can do something aggressive to sort of bleed off some of that angry energy. So the idea is they think aggressive behavior helps discharge aggressive energy. So I'm in a bad mood, so I'm going to go play a violent video game to make myself feel better. Or I'm going to go home and I'm going to scream into a pillow until all of that aggression leaves my body. They typically find that this can temporarily reduce the impulses to be aggressive, but for the most part, this ends up not working long term. There have been a bunch of studies trying to look at sort of how much of an effect it has, and it might be partially due to, say, some placebo effect where they think it's going to help, so it does. But it tends not to cause a dramatic reduction overall. One kind of, it kind of fits here, but is a little bit different, is when we can channel some aggressive impulses into more socially acceptable behaviors. Things like if you find that you are often sort of full of energy that you want to get out in aggressive ways, if you take up, say, kickboxing, that can be a healthy way to deal with that long term, instead of just sort of bleeding off that in, say, violent video games or whatever. But the more research I've done on that idea of catharsis, it kind of gets a little bit muddy. We'll talk a little bit more about things like violence in video games and violence in media later on. But there's some people who think that it's a big thing, some people think that it's nothing, and we're probably going to end up somewhere in the middle. The first of our sort of aggression-based behaviors that we're going to look at is called over-controlled hostility. And this is their way of saying that sometimes we see that some individuals will show almost no reaction to different events that might lead to aggressive behavior in others. They might show very little response at the time, but what ends up happening is that these individuals are sort of internalizing each of those small slights, and eventually, after having multiple provocations that accumulate, we might then see a sudden eruption into violence that on the surface might seem like it's sort of aggression far out of proportion to the event that prompted it, but because it's actually the sum of a bunch of acts previously that were never sort of dealt with, it's sort of that accumulation of all of those at once. Kind of like the violence equivalent of the straw that broke the camel's back, where you were able to kind of internalize and handle a whole bunch of things, but then one last thing sets you off and can cause a very aggressive response. So in this situation, from the outside, you kind of have to consider prior things, prior stimuli that might have led to this, because what would have been immediately apparent might not have looked like it should explain the behavior that we're observing. But if we track back in that individual's history, so maybe they had a bad morning, or the day previously was really stressful or something like that, that can help us explain why this seems like a sudden out of left field burst of violence. So yeah, the proper term for that is over-controlled hostility. And then the next little bit is looking at the effects of media violence on violent behavior. And this is one of those areas that within psychology, they've been talking about this and trying to study this for pretty much as long as there's been violence in media. Because even if you look back at when they first started having televisions in people's homes, there was a lot of sort of grumbling about the fact that we'd be exposing people to all of these different things, and it might be corrupting, especially the youth. So they wanted to control what was shown on TV, and they wanted to control exposure to different things. And from there, people have been looking for evidence either for or against this idea that exposure to violence would lead to an increase in violent behavior. So this is, as you might be able to expect, this is one of those things where it's a lot more complicated than how it's typically presented, especially if you look at something like, say, a news article or somebody on the evening news giving a presentation about this. They typically end up very much cherry picking the data that they find and not acknowledging how complicated this issue is. And in fact, when we start looking at sort of media violence here, we're going to be comparing back to that concept of catharsis that we had mentioned before. So the idea that perhaps some people might choose, after having a really rough day, maybe they're going to go and play some violent video games to sort of vent some steam to make themselves feel better. So that might be one aspect of it that we can consider. We also want to consider, here we're pointing out social learning. So we're watching violence in those video games or in TV shows, and that might make us feel that that is an acceptable level of violence, and then maybe sort of adjust our standards for what is appropriate to display within society. That's at least the theory people put forth. But again, we're going to look at a couple of other things that might be driving this, especially when we get into the results from some of these studies. So starting with what's on the slide, and I'm going to try not to go too far off into left field, but here we have a study. They've split by sex, usually because they typically find a larger effect in males versus females. But that is another one of those confounding variables that we can talk about later. But in this situation, we're looking at the amount of violent TV watched per age. That's the color coding on the bars. So those who had low exposure to violent TV shows, moderate exposure, or high exposure to those TV shows. Here they haven't specified how they quantified that, but it'd probably be something like, how many hours a week does your child watch shows like this? Because if we're looking at, so age 8, you wouldn't really rely on the children as the ones reporting this. So it would have to be, say, a parent or guardian reporting how much TV they're watching. And then what we have in the graph here is on, Yep, mouse on the right screen, there we go. So this is going to be the serious of criminal acts by age 30. So this is sort of a combined score where they looked at number of violent acts, how intense those acts were, where the greater the intensity, the higher the score would be. And they're just basically looking for correlations. And so we see that within each of the sexes, we find that those who had the most exposure to violent TV at a young age ended up showing more violent and more intensely violent acts by the time they were 30. So this would be sort of supporting some of the fear-mongering in the media saying, hey, violent TV is making the youth more violent. However, I want you to consider things like what else might correlate with a child having lots of time to sit around and watch violent TV? One of the things they've also found that correlates with greater violent acts in the future is having absentee parents, or having parents who sit them in front of the TV and let them watch whatever they want to sort of distract their child. So it might not actually be the violence itself, but it might be the environment that allowed them to both become violent and allowed them to watch TV without any kind of supervision. So they've pointed to stuff like that. So a lot of the studies that have been done, at least the earlier studies, they might not have considered some of those other third variables that can be a driving force here. Yeah, so when we look at results like that, we kind of want to take it with a grain of salt, because on paper, if you looked at that and you would say, hey, what we need to then do is remove violence from TV, that might not be telling the whole story. Other things like, I can tie it back into, again, a little bit of personal experience. Used to work at a Best Buy, like I've mentioned. And video games have very intense sort of ratings of violence levels. And you are physically not allowed to sell violent video games to anyone under the age of, I think it was 25 for some of them, or 18 for others, depending on how intense the ratings are. And so having those types of rules put into place, the same as they did with putting ratings systems on movies, where you can't buy a movie ticket if you're under a certain age without parental approval, or for some of them, you're not allowed, if you're under a certain age at all, parental approval or no. Those were all put into place to try and help mitigate this. But you then run into the issues of what if a parent comes in with their 5-year-old child and decides to buy the next Call of Duty for them, sort of ignoring the fact that there's an age restriction on it. And as a cashier, you can only point out that mature rating, but you can't really control anything as long as it's the parent buying it. So there's a whole bunch of different things to consider in that situation. But yeah. So what they think might be going on here, and the stuff that gets muddied with other social effects and stuff like that. So we've mentioned the whole social learning. So we're watching these things happen. We can tie that into modeling, where you see a behavior, and especially if you see it over and over again, you might then be more likely to copy it yourself. So we've mentioned if you see someone solving a problem successfully using one particular method, you then might be inclined to do that yourself. So you might choose to model some of these violent behaviors that are solving problems in video games or TV shows in real life, not necessarily realizing that it is appropriate in some conditions and definitely not in others, or that separation of reality and fiction. But yeah, so we start seeing that aggression can be rewarded, and by being exposed to it over and over again, it can actually desensitize people to it. So the more you see it, the more it's sort of interpreted as normal, and the less of a response that we'd have to it. So it wouldn't put people off as much when they see it often. So yeah, that's some other stuff that they're thinking is driving it in the background. But when we get down to it and we start looking at, okay, well, specifically if we zoom in on violent video games, because there, the people who are being exposed to it are in control of the violence, which kind of adds an extra level to it. we end up seeing sort of a weak positive correlation between the amount of violent video games played and aggressive behavior once we control for those other factors. So even though our graph ended up looking like a really, really strong relationship, when we start controlling for other things, we kind of lose some of that strength, which is why we focus on that potential for other aspects that might be involved. So the strongest relationship, because they've looked at sort of different genres, different types of games, would be games that involve violent fantasy action, because those tend to be a little bit more intense. But that's also kind of interesting, because a lot of the fantasy genre might get you away from killing opponents who are, say, humans, and get you into sort of other types of creatures, which we would have assumed might have led us away from applying it to real life, but apparently not so from the studies. And when they followed up to see if, hey, maybe violent video games, rather than being something that predisposes people to violence, might actually help them vent violence from aggression in sort of a safer way, they end up finding that it isn't necessarily a super effective manner to do that. So like we said, when we were talking about catharsis as one of those ways to vent anger healthily, some research says that it could help if that's sort of your belief that it will help, but for the most part, everything else being equal, it tends not to end up causing that drop in aggression that we would have anticipated. All right, we can start talking about altruism or pro-social behavior, like I said, taking a big swing in the opposite direction, going from harming or hurting behavior to helping behavior. And so in this case, if we talk about altruism, we're talking about helping somebody else without necessarily getting a benefit to yourself. So usually we tend to look at things like altruism versus cooperation, where cooperation would be something like two organisms working together for mutual benefit. So you and some other individual are going to work together to study for a test. One of you is really good at one subject and one of you is good at another subject, and by helping each other, you both do better overall. You cooperated and won out. Altruism would be more like one individual helped the other and doesn't seem to get anything out of it. So you help someone in a subject that you're good at, but you don't get anything in return. They don't pay you, they don't help you study for something else. And if we look at this from our evolutionary scientific point of view, we run into an issue where it's really, really hard to tell a story with natural selection as to why a behavior like that might have occurred. Because putting resources out, putting yourself at risk, doing something with no return, there's really no benefit to that. Because usually when we're telling our evolutionary stories, we're looking for some kind of selective benefit. We're looking for that ability to survive better and reproduce more, to pass on your genes. So how do these behaviors end up occurring if they're potentially even reducing your fitness? They're reducing your ability to survive and reproduce, especially in some of the examples they use here. So we have two evolutionary explanations that occur. The first is the idea of kin selection. So this says that putting yourself at risk to help others isn't a problem from our evolutionary stance if the others that you are helping have the same genes as you. So if you are helping your children or your parents or someone who has the same genes that you do and they would be able to pass on your same genes, then we can say that there's some kind of pressure there, because the genes that you would have passed on yourself are being passed on by close relatives. So it's net the same as far as natural selection has occurred. So we say we're more likely to help others that we share the most genes with. And in this situation, what we would look for is, okay, if we have a species, who are they helping? And let's check their genetic relatedness. You should be more likely to help your children or your siblings than you are to help your fourth cousins. And so they do a lot of stuff like this, studying things like meerkats, because meerkats are known to live in large colonies, and individuals will stand on guard and actually make really loud alarm calls if a predator shows up. And by doing that, they are delaying their own escape into a safe burrow, and they're making loud sounds that draws attention to them. So they're putting themselves at risk from this predator. And to support this theory, we would see that they end up making more alarm calls, being louder and lasting longer in their position if close relatives are nearby. Whereas if it is unrelated individuals, they might be less likely to give a full alarm call. They might leave faster to protect themselves. And there are a bunch of species that end up showing this, where we see more helping behavior for those who are more closely related to us. Another example or another option to explain away this potential problem is called reciprocal altruism. And from the name, you might expect that it involves some form of reciprocity. So this one only really works in species that have A, social groups, and B, enough of a memory to remember who they have interacted with in the past and how those interactions have gone. So they will help those who have helped them in the past, and they will not help those who have not helped in the past. So in this situation, this ties into the example I've used with my ravens, where the ravens, if they know that somebody has been reliable and trustworthy and not stolen food in the past, they are more likely to be helpful to share food and things like that. But those who have stolen food or been unhelpful, they're unlikely to be helped in the future. So this only really works when we can track past encounters, but works for our ravens and other corvids, and we can see this in humans as well, where we tend to be a little bit more likely to interact positively with those we have a history of positive interactions with. All right, so those are our sort of evolutionary explanations for this, but this is a psych course, so we can go into social and cultural influences as well, more human-sided things. So we've already mentioned before our norm of reciprocity as a way of sort of convincing people to do something for us, but it actually ties in with pro-social behavior. Because like we said, that norm of reciprocity, it can be a manipulation tactic, but it is also pretty core to just how people work. So we tend to help those who help us. This is typically how things like friendships work, where if you've had positive interactions, somebody has helped you out, you're going to do the same for them. So very, very similar to what we had with our reciprocal altruism, but framed in a more cognitive way where we're able to kind of evaluate, hey, you've been helpful, I can return the favor. We can also have another one of our norms here, but it's a norm of social responsibility. And so this comes from the culture that you are part of, but it basically says that we get this feeling that we should help others and end up contributing to society's welfare overall. And this will differ between different countries, different cultures. If we go back to our individualistic versus collectivist cultures, we would of course expect a lot more of this social responsibility in our collectivist cultures, where they tend to consider the sort of health of the society overall above an individual's place. So in that situation, we probably see a lot more helping behavior because they would feel like it's their responsibility to help others within their community. Versus in individualistic cultures, we typically are going to look at it as, well, is this something that's my problem, or is this sort of out of my hands? Is this somebody else's responsibility? And we could even go back to when we were discussing our bystander effect and what influences helping behavior. It's all influenced by what's the norm for the group that we're part of. Some other aspects to consider is previous experience, socialization. So if children are taught more pro-social behaviors young, they're going to exhibit more pro-social behaviors as they get older. And it tends to tie in with empathy. So if you are teaching your children to sort of think of the individuals that you're helping, maybe put yourself in their shoes, they're more likely to continue that activity and to continue the helping that goes with it as they get older. So it is something that can be learned. So it doesn't have to be, say, learned just from a culture, but it can be learned sort of at the level of a family. So if you are raised with, say, making regular donations or volunteering in a food bank, you might be more likely to persist in those activities as you get older, probably because it's been normalized. We've already mentioned some of our cultural influences, and like we said, sort of the individualistic versus collectivist cultures. And it can sort of differ even within our individual versus collectivistic cultures, because they might have different sort of focuses, different things that are important to those individual locations. But yeah, so we have the two examples here. India would serve as a collectivist culture. And so there's this moral obligation to help regardless of the size of need. These individuals will be a lot more likely to, say, volunteer their time or donate in the case of emergency or help others in need in their community. Whereas in North America, we tend to see that depends on the degree of help that's required. Basically, if somebody needs something huge, we are fairly quick to say that's not my responsibility, I can't do that. But if it's something small, then we might be able to do it. And it kind of depends on the situation, but also it depends on closeness to the individual. I don't think that I have those studies here, but I can talk about it off the top of my head. But they've basically looked at, if you consider, say, degree of relatedness, past experiences, the culture that you're in, and the size of the help that's required, all of those factors are kind of weighted equally to sort of determine, do you or don't you help? So if it's somebody who's helped you before, there's that, yeah, I should help them in return, even if it's a big ask. Whereas if it's a complete stranger, then maybe you do something small, but not something larger. So maybe you'd give somebody on the street the change that you have in your pocket, but you wouldn't want to, say, help get them into a temporary shelter or something that required more involvement. And yeah, again, that can be affected by culture as well. So a whole bunch of different factors involved. If you're curious, there's a study they did fairly recently. I can't remember what class I had to study up on this for, but they were basically looking at the helping behaviors when people were responding to natural disasters. In fact, we might end up talking about it again in our health and stress chapter, so I won't do too much detail here. But they were basically looking at, are you willing to offer intangible help, things like advice? Or are you willing to offer money? Or are you willing to offer things like space in your home? And what factors end up influencing sort of those degrees? And then the last slide here is returning to that link between empathy and altruism, or at least one of the hypotheses that's trying to link those two concepts. So empathy, like we mentioned, is our ability to share another's experience or basically put yourself in someone else's shoes. And typically we find that if you have more feelings of empathy, you are then more likely to help. So if you are thinking more empathetically, you are more likely to offer assistance. And so this empathy altruism hypothesis is basically saying that you need to be empathetic in order to have these altruistic behaviors. However, we have some less optimistic approaches, like our negative state relief model, that basically says that people would be helping not because they're putting themselves in other shoes and they're being selfless, but because when they see someone in need, it makes them feel bad. And then by helping, they can actually end up alleviating some of their distress. You end up helping, showing this empathetic behavior because it helps reduce your feelings, your personal feelings of distress. And this is one of the things that they sometimes point to. If you look at with TV advertisements, if you've ever had one of those where they're trying to get you to donate for a particular cause and they show you really sad pictures of puppies or children or some cause that needs your help. And that's usually with very sad music, and it's trying to make you feel as bad as possible so that you are then compelled to reach out and donate through this particular organization to sort of alleviate some of those feelings of guilt.